commemorating the past, reflecting on the present, envisioning a future. 1962
Mother
and
of
beyond.
men and ruler of the world, raises her noble head and approaches the court of justice with the clarion call for equal rights for Bahamian women.
Our right to vote and our right to hold office should never be taken lightly and should be exercised at every opportunity.
True, we women are ready, willing, and able. You must no longer deny us our rights.
He reneges as he interrupts his female protagonist's narrative to examine the state of black masculinity by telling the story of Barbadian men, most notably Sargent. I argue that Clarke problematically uses the black female body as a conduit to demonstrate or explore the history of colonization and its crippling of black Caribbean men, oftentimes denying them a much desired citizenship rendered through the guise of a normative definition of masculinity. Instead of allowing for a full-fledged empowering experience within the realms of prostitution with women at its center, Clarke reinvents the very wheel he challenges. While exploring the varying complexities of gender representations, both male and female, can be constructive and informative, to investigate one at the expense of the other is dangerous and troublesome. To date, scholars have argued that women and racialized others have been excluded from the very concepts of citizenship. Citizenship is part of the state efforts to control racializations, sexualities, and procreation. As Evelyn Glenn has argued, quote, citizenship has been a principal institution formation within which race and gender relations, meanings, and identities have been constituted, end of quote. Further, Mimi Scheller pontificates that, quote, concepts of citizenship and freedom were liberated with and upon the disavowed abject body of the slave, while gendered, racial, and sexual courses, and interbodily relations together informed the political power and struggle over freedom in post-slavery societies, end of quote. To this end, it makes sense that Caribbean men and women struggle to occupy and perform within the space of this said citizenship. The search for citizenship directly correlates with the search for selfhood, where subjects want to be recognized as free to control one's sexuality, to reproduce, to just be. Clarke's characters in his Barbadian community, both male and female, are struggling to locate the freedom that citizenship is supposed to afford a subject. However, due to their racialized and gendered selves, are unable to secure it. Freedom is constrained due to social inequalities and often undocumented, sometimes state-regulated, policies of deviance. Clarke's The Polished Hoe is certainly a useful literary exploration of the quest for citizenship in post-slavery Barbados, as he examines the subject positioning of the black female prostitute who consciously participates in sex work, not seeing herself as a victim, and the destitute black male who desperately wants to be counted as masculine in the most normative orthodox definition, and citizen. Clarke's attempt to give voice to the experiences of black women post-slavery is commendable in that it places him in good stead to contribute to the work of feminists who challenge gender disparities as they create spaces for women within Caribbean narratives about nationhood. Important work, as it should not only be the job of women to advocate on behalf of women or centering women's experiences in order to create a more gender-balanced representation of post-colonial experiences. Men, too, can be active participants in exploring women's issues as long as it's done responsibly. Clarke's intention is to empower women through his characterization of Mary as a polished whore, one who has come to be and should be respected in spite of how she attains her success. And I understand a polished whore to be one who participates in prostitution or, to use a more contemporary term, sex work, but is viewed as highbrow. She's also well-trained in cultural capital that often earns middle and upper classes and some working class subjects who can navigate the performance of high society behavior, respectability. Mary is well-versed in high art and knowledgeable of cultural culinary etiquette. It almost seems that Clarke wants to soften as he challenges the reality of societal readings of whoredom as immoral and deviant within his use of polished. His use of polish can be viewed as representation of his efforts to elevate the status of the whore, to deem her work acceptable, and to suggest rightfully that sex work and the potential power it can offer to its participants cannot be easily dismissed. Clark's desire seems to be one where he begs the celebration of Ma, Mary, and others like them, who are able to turn a system, prostitution, that has the potential to further denigrate them belly up as they seek autonomy and success. Early in the novel, Clark carefully outlines the vulnerability of residents in his Barbadian community by illuminating the racist and class structures that prohibit them from self-actualization. Disadvantaged after slavery, it's almost impossible to sustain themselves and their families. I would argue that Clark's attempt to address race and class disparities is successful. However, his evaluation of gender inequities falls apart when he interrupts Mary's central narrative to produce a male meta-narrative. As Clark explores Sargent's frail identity and subjectivity that is fraught with insecurities about his manhood, he makes a desperate attempt to save Sargent. As he plays Christ to Sargent and makes attempts to rescue him from the ridicule of white males, it seems that Clark has to renege on the agency he affords Mary in other places in the novel. Clark challenges hegemonic racist and classist discourses effectively, but does not effectively challenge sexism as he ends up privileging a patriarchal discourse about black women's sexuality. He re-objectifies Mary to save Sargent. And Wigmore Francis, in her article, 19th and early 20th century Perspectives of Women, says, Black Caribbean male thinkers who could discern the class, race, and colonial dynamics of the classist, racist, and imperialist societies in which they flourished could not similarly discern the patriarchal structures of those same societies, end of quote, and I would agree with that. Clark spends much time exploring the vulnerability of Black Caribbean men and explores what it means for Black men to be disempowered through his construction of Sargent. More notably, he seems very concerned with them as sexual beings and the ways in which they have not been able to usurp the patriarchal power that being male afforded white men. Considering the disempowerment of Black males during slavery and their denial of manhood, it is not surprising that the emasculation of the Black male identity remains a subject of inquiry. This is made quite clear in Clark's examination of the childhood experiences of young Black Barbadian males who, even as they were being taught how to be men in school, felt emasculated beyond school walls due to their impoverished state and the fact that they had to defer to the white ruling class by whom they were mostly employed. Sargent's colonial education that preached manners maketh man, but even with acquired manners, these Black boys are still powerless. Only a select few will escape the grip of poverty and a lifetime of labor with few benefits. Sargent is one who makes it somewhat. He qualifies for an admission to the Bimshire Constabulary and successfully climbs the ranks, but his inability to conquer the most desired woman in the village, Mary, thwarts his success. Yet again, his failure to do so is influenced by his former impoverished background and his ability to, quote, afford a polished horse such as Mary. And he tells Mary about whites. He says, them always had and we never got. Sargent recalls his boyhood desires for Mary and is angered by his inability to afford her or become her knight in shining armor. When he's called to take her statement about Belfield's death, he refers to her as a woman he has known since childhood. He says, it is a knowledge that was shaped by the distance that controlled status and complexion and that tested love itself. A woman he still loves but dare not tell her. A woman who years before had caused his small heart to palpitate and his tom pigeon, meaning his penis, to throb in little spasms, end of quote. Conjuring the memory of Mary joining Belfields in a cave during a community picnic, he reflects on his inability to rescue her from Belfields and his powerlessness amidst the laughter of the white Solicitor General and his cronies who profess that Mary is too young for Belfields, yet revel in their own desires to, quote, take a piece off of she too, end of quote. Unable to defend Mary, he gallops down the beach, repeating, I hate Mary, I hate Mary, I hate Mary. The actions of these white men is indicative of the ways in which they exploited Black women in order not to only dominate and repress them, but also to demoralize Black men. Unable to articulate his frustration with white male privilege, Sargent projects his anger onto Mary, where she becomes the enemy. Elizabeth Fox Genovese lends a critical understanding of the complications that can potentially evolve between black women and black men when she ascertains, quote, "It seemed clear that the sexual exploitation of black women by white men might poison those women's relations with the men of their own people who might, in all too human a fashion, turn their rage against the victim. As a result, in any given instance, the most violent abusers of slave women's sexuality might be black rather than white men," end of quote. Blinded by his so-called hatred for Mary, Sargent is incapable of visualizing that his chivalric intentions are not done out of empathy for Mary, but his jealousy of the power of white men and his desire to simply have a piece of Mary. Sargent is afforded another opportunity to rescue Mary and perhaps fulfill his sexual desires when she attempts to seduce him during the dictation of her statement. And those of you who've read the novel know that this is another part of her act in terms of seducing Sargent so that perhaps by the end she can walk away having killed Belfields. And I think she's pretty successful by the end. She too has had to veil her affection for Sargent, not only because of Belfield's known jealousy, but also because she understood that Sargent could not afford her privileged existence. With Belfield's dead, she seduces him. Here, Clark grants Mary agency in that she transcends survival sex and has an opportunity to experience a passionate sexual encounter with a former childhood friend. To Sargent's disappointment, he is unable to accept Mary's sexual offers. When she invites him to play a musical selection on the piano, where metaphorically she becomes the piano he's unable to play. Quote, "He has never before sat at a piano of such beauty and magnificence. His hands begin to shake. He is incapable of going further. This is like a journey into the unknown, a challenge to embark upon this journey that he somehow knows he cannot take." This metaphor of Mary's piano, polished but now available to Sargent, is artfully constructed. However, Mary is disturbingly objectified when Clark refers to her as a piano to be played. Again, she's stripped of the sexual agency he grants earlier by objectifying her as he tries to defend Sargent's failures. Comparing Mary to the other men he has had sexual encounters with, such as Mary's servant Gertrude, Sargent finds Mary's polished status intimidating and crippling. She becomes a representation of the unfamiliar, and he finds this challenge daunting. Recognizing Sargent's discomfort, Mary sits on the piano bench next to him. She places her hands over his, and as if she's a kindergarten teacher guiding him in the first curves of learning penmanship, controlling his handwriting, she guides his hands over the keys, and he looks up at her into her eyes, and she gives him back the look and continues to guide his hands over the keys. She removes her hands. No sound rises from the keyboard, end of quote. Sargent again is unable to accept Mary's seductive gestures and becomes childlike. Mary makes yet another overt attempt where she places her body teasingly before him just out of his reach and then proceeds to lead him to her bed. Sargent wants to respond, but, quote, "He is scared. The fear is like heat, white and searing, and the impetus to rape is there," end of quote. Despite Mary's direct invitation, Sargent is unable to perform. What becomes striking is that his fear is replaced by an impulse to rape. Why rape? Is it because he's intimidated by Mary's bold sexual advances? Is he used to being the hunter rather than sexual prey? I surmise that Sargent's inability to be intimate with Mary is a combination of issues of him feeling emasculated because he's being seduced and disempowered because he has to defer to Mary's social standing as Mr. Belfield's mistress. First, he has been socialized to believe that sexual desire, gratification, and power are male terrains and feels threatened by her sexual agency. M. Jackie Alexander argues that women's sexual agency have always been troublesome for the state as it destabilizes established notions of respectability and destabilizes traditional representations of black middle-class womanhood. It is therefore difficult for Sargent to support Mary's sexual agency and erotic autonomy, as it would mean challenging his preconceived ideas of respectability and relinquishing male privilege. Lyndon Lewis uncovers the nature of Sargent's angst when he writes, quote, what is of central importance to the concept of masculinity remains the exercise of power and the issue of control. Masculinity is predicated on the presumption of power, whether real or imagined. Though not all men exercise power, all nevertheless view it as an entitlement, end of quote. If Sargent feels disempowered by Mary's sexual advances, perhaps the only way he can conceive of reclaiming it would be through the violent act of rape. The rapist, in the most generic sense, is typically viewed as one who desires power and enjoys dominating his victim. Violating Mary, rather than succumbing to her sexual seduction, would grant Sargent the power he needs, or he seeks. Mary's social class and the privilege that is associated with it intimidates him. This is revealed as he notes how simple it would have been to have taken Gertrude, who is of a lower social class, and Mary's maid, rather than a woman of substance like Mary. Gertrude's own class standing positions her to be exploited by Sargent, allowing him to occupy traditional definitions of masculinity, where men are the empowered subjects in sexual acts. I also think that the space in which Mary is operating, this great house with all of these amenities, and it makes it really difficult for him to feel comfortable to be intimate with her, whereas he's had several experiences with Gertrude rustling and tussling around in the cane field. Sargent wishes he was, quote, a man brought up with a stronger sense of confidence, with a background in family and position that was solid enough to make him able to see this woman before him in the same confidence of presumption as he sees Gertrude. Sargent's insecurities are no doubt largely based on race and class location and his inability to move beyond this lack of privilege. He can't seem to relate to Mary as a counterpart. The threat of having to defer to Belfields, a white male, even though Belfields is dead, is a reality for Sargent. He's unable to erase this sense of deference and could very well be afraid of failing to please Mary in that he may not be capable of satisfying a woman of her stature, one who appears to know well the art of seduction. Both Mary and Sargent are caught in the ambivalent and problematic representation of relationships between black women and men in the planter society reinvented in Clarke's The Polished Hoe. In closing, The Polished Hoe, Mary's narrative becomes secondary to that of the male characters and their own quest or struggle for autonomy. She's used to produce Clarke's expressivity of black Caribbean masculinity. Mary is implicated as one who emasculates black men when she opts to save herself for Belfields and becomes Clarke's instrument to articulate the black Caribbean male experience in post-slavery. Arguably, in his attempt to liberate and empower Mary, Clarke pimps her by constantly interrupting her story to offer a more refined exploration of black male identities. It is certainly possible for a text to serve multiple purposes where both female and male identities are explored, but as readers, we're pimped into believing that the author will provide a better rounded text exploring Mary's negotiation of various subject positions in her quest for self-actualization and citizenship. Instead, Clarke uses Mary's body as a conduit to demonstrate the history of colonization and, more notably, to examine the subject position of black men in plantation societies. Thank you.
Conceptualizing the discursive performance of Afro-Caribbean masculinities in Austin Clarke's The Origin of Waves. Austin Clarke's persistent preoccupation with the question of what it is to be a Caribbean man at home and abroad, from his first novel, Survivors of the Crossing, to The Origin of Waves and beyond, as you have heard, to The Polished Hoe, facilitates an examination of the performance of Caribbean masculinities abroad, and more significantly, the relationship between performance and discursive production. Performance excess, so central to Clarke's representation of masculinities, has been variously read as one, the mimetic representation of the naturalness of theatricality to Caribbean culture, this is by Lloyd Brown, or two, the artificial masquerade, masking the real man, this is Daniel Coleman, and three, as the psychoanalytic overcompensation for male vulnerabilities, Eddie White. However, I would like to link performance and its excess to the discursive production of gendered subjectivities by focusing on Clarke's self-conscious staging of audience reception that illustrates Deborah Taylor's view that, quote, embodied performances are always in situ. And what she means by that, intelligible in the framework of the immediate environment. These concepts will help me to revisit Judith Butler's notion of performative recitation and embodiment, and to factor the performance context of intimacy in expanded other performances of Caribbean masculinities than the excessive public displays attempt to reinforce. I'm indebted to my friend Jared Brown for shifting my focus to the concept of intimacy. Clarke's excessive staging of these performances exposes Caribbean maleness as a site of discursive construction and contestation. Unlike the foremost Clarke critic, Lloyd Brown, who argues in his mimetic symbolic reading of Caribbean culture that the masquerade of carnival is, quote, faithful expression and natural symbol, unquote, of the performance traditions in Caribbean cultures, I argue that the excessive theatrical moments in Clarke's work expose the nature of discursive production itself. Austin Clarke's exploration of Caribbean masculinities can be understood in light of Judith Butler's argument in Bodies That Matter that gendered realities are a matter of performative production. Using the expressive tradition of Caribbean culture, including sweet talk, broad talk, performative English, biblical English, and rituals like church testimony, Clarke demonstrates the ways in which performance provides the opportunity to both reinforce and reinvent the discourses of Caribbean masculinities. Yet Clarke's self-conscious staging of these excessive performances, and more importantly, the reception of the performances, reinforce the idea that gender discourses are not just reliant on their repeated performances or their reiterative effects, as Butler contends. They also demand an applauding audience. Moreover, audience reception forces us to consider the situ of performance and the way in which the context of the rumbar as confessional makes intimacy an important lens to see a fuller range of masculinities that might be available for public display. While I agree with Butler and Coleman that all performances are embodied, and that this embodiment opens the possibility for refraction, Coleman's term, and troubling, Butler's term, of gender norms, I want to include audience reception, especially in the context of intimacy, as important to the theories of normative identity disruption. In this case, the fact that the material bodies of these men are aging create difficulties for the performance of the social script of the sexual stud. Tim is already suffering from impotence, and John is having serious anxieties about his sexual abilities. While the possibility for overindulgence is quite expected, given the context of this excessive verbal performance is a rumbar, the rumbar for Clarke is both an exhibition stage as well as a confessional, that public space, and also one that's recreated to be private. In this way, Clarke reminds us of how different audiences, public and private, demand different performative selves and articulate different kinds of validations. The character's own anxiety in his gender performance and the author's narrative self-reflexivity point us to the power of the audience to sanction various masculinities. From the lens of audience reception, different configurations of masculinity emerge. Beyond the images of the confident stud, there also emerge views of these men as insecure and sexually compromised, but also sensitive and nurturing. Repetition alone does not guarantee discursive institution. Validation is also necessary in the conceptualization of the role of performance in gender production. Daniel Coleman's Masculine Migrations offers a useful entry point for discussing the ways in which Clarke's representation of Caribbean masculinities abroad initiates an examination of the relationship between performance and gender discourse. In this important work, Coleman uses new Canadian narratives like Clarke's to expose the fractures in the old constructions of Canadian masculinities. In the chapter entitled Plain Mass, Hustling Respect, He specifically discusses Clarke's representation of Caribbean Canadian masculinities in the short story collection, 9 Men Who Laughed. Clarke's stories allow Coleman to explore masculinity in multicultural transition. And Clarke and other new Canadian writers, Coleman argues, challenged the norms of Canadian masculinities and exposed, quote, the incoherent partialities and provisionalities within those metropolitan codes. Typical of the inclusionary politics of a liberal multiculturalism, Coleman engages a recuperation of marginal subjectivities in order to examine normative center constructions. And I'm taking from him the value of looking at marginality, the outside, spaces that Butler calls spaces of uninhabitability. And that this becomes a wonderful clue to start to read Caribbean masculinities. However, it does not posit Caribbean masculinities as outside Canadian constructions of maleness. He shows how Caribbean codes reveal the instability and heterogeneity of traditional constructions of Canadian masculinities. Coleman finds Clarke useful to understand the nature of Canadian masculinities and the ways in which the material contexts of masculine performances expose the instabilities of gender constructions. In my reading, I would like to show how Clarke illuminates Caribbean masculinities and helps us to understand the ways in which performativity itself might also help to explain these destabilizations. The other significant point of departure between Coleman's analysis and mine has to do with the rhetorical imprint of dualities in his argument. Although by the end of this chapter on Clarke, Coleman recognizes that performativity helps to produce the discourse of masculinity, his rhetoric recalls Lloyd Brown's oppositions between the material world and the symbolic order. Thus, Coleman speaks of Joshua's masculine performances, quote, as all a masquerade. And he claims that, quote, underneath the finery, there is only hot air. This clear-cut separation between nature and discourse, reality and artifice, the material and the symbolic, might not help to reinforce Coleman's finer point that, quote, metropolitan masculinity is in fact that surface, unquote. Rhetorically, Coleman suggests that Joshua's performances of masculinity belong to the world of artifice than the world of reality. And such a position begs the question whether Coleman is not attracted, perhaps seduced, to having the muddiness of the truth-fiction divide settled. In invoking an ironic paradigm, Coleman eventually ends his discussion contemplating the paradox of the character's, quote, compulsion to enact an ideal that is itself bogus. For him, what Clarke's characters teach us is, quote, how seamed with contradictions the category of manhood is in the first place. It is the seeming paradox that raises the question of the value of performance to discursive production. Judith Butler's discussion of discursivity and performativity in her book Bodies That Matter helps to push Coleman's insights a little further. In this book that follows Gender Trouble, used heavily by Coleman, Butler attempts to respond to criticism raised about the earlier work and refines her position on the relationship between performance and discursive production. For her, gender difference cannot be separated from discursive demarcations, so that according to Butler, quote, sexual difference is never simply a function of material differences, which are not in the same way both marked and formed by discursive practices, unquote. Such discursive maneuvers depend, for her, on, quote, certain highly regulated practices that rely on performance. Thus, performativity represents, quote, the reiterative and citational practice by which discourse produces the effects that it names, unquote. But it is this dependence on performance for naturalizing constructions that leads to the contradictions that Coleman confronts in Clarke's stories. While performance, through its repetitive possibilities, helps to install normative discourse, it also creates the conditions for transforming, undoing those norms. Material embodiment in each repetition, as both Coleman and Butler argue, offer the possibility for deflections from and expansions of the normative standards. These deflections are constituted as, quote, the zone of uninhabitability, unquote, that works to, quote, constitute the defining limit of the subject's domain. For Butler, quote, the subject is constituted through the force of exclusion and abjection, one which produces a constitutive outside to the subject, an abjected outside, which is after all inside the subject as its own founding repudiation. It means that the very condition that is set that excludes aspect is defining that moment of exclusion, those possibilities of exclusion. Consequently, she sets out to explore how such disavowed abjection might threaten to expose the self-grounding presumptions of the sexed subject. The crucial question for Butler is, quote, what challenge does that excluded and abjected realm produce to a symbolic hegemony that might force a radical rearticulation of what qualifies as what bodies that matter? In this paper, therefore, I want to use the concept of the performance situ of intimacy as exposing what Butler calls that abjected zone of an outside that threatens to destabilize the hegemony of normative masculinity. I will suggest that it is the very nature of performances themselves that ensure that no social script can be realized exactly, and that the attention to the gaps in these performances might help to expand these normative myths of manhood. I think that Austin Clarke's fictional explorations help us to see how a reading of these performances of the social scripts of masculinity reveals the provisionalities of gender constructions. As Butler argues, because these performances must inevitably betray the official script, an excess of performance holds the promise of normative fulfillment. This is the value, I think, that we need to pay attention to performative excess in Clarke's work. In Austin Clarke's Origin, there's a curious excess of masculine performances that forces one to think about the value of performance to discursive production. Male characters in the first instance are engaged in repeatedly performing the social scripts of manhood. In this regard, gender is what they do, an activity that, if repeated over time, consolidates their gender identity. As Taylor argues, quote, performances function as vital acts of transfer, transmitting social knowledge, memory, and a sense of identity through reiterated, or what Richard Schechner has called, twice-behaved behavior. However, the production of this identity seems to also rely on verbal performances as well. It's as if what they do, these social scripts, are not enough. So that the masculine gender is also what they say they do. In addition to the male character's social and verbal performances, there are moments of performative self-consciousness that mark these characters' verbal and social performances as performance. And this remarking reminds us that Clarke's own representation of gendered subjectivities is itself a stage textual performance. What I mean by the self-consciousness in these men's display of certain social scripts is their very conscious attention to audience response, that they are playing to an audience. And the male narrators of their own stories are constantly playing to an audience, and their narrative disclosures appear to be confessions to readers or to the audience about their need to perform, and therefore and in this way reinforce gendered identity. These inordinate cycles of performances dramatize the repeated effects of discursive production. Clarke's repeated representation of Caribbean masculinities throughout most of his writings, at first blush, might seem to be troubling, as this kind of repeated citation might only be reinforcing certain gender stereotypes. His characters, by their actions, produce images of the Caribbean man performing the roles of stud, successful breadwinner, superior male partner in charge of his woman, homophobic macho man, and a strong competitor in physical and other feats among his fellow men. Because of time constraints, I will focus on the stereotype of the black man's sexual prowess, because this is the essential problem of these two old men, and they are haunted by their inability to live up to this requirement for being considered a real Caribbean man. In The Origin of Waves, two geriatric men who have not seen each other for over 50 years literally collide into each other on Yonge Street in Toronto one winter day, and they take the opportunity to reminisce and catch up with each other in a rum bar. The two men's recollections of their activities as children and as adults seem to be attempts at reiterating their masculine status according to gender norms. Tim, for example, remembers his male relative's stories of conquest of women and the sea. Quote, "We were sitting on the same sand where our fathers and uncles used to sit in the long storytelling nights of accidents at sea and of women they loved," unquote. According to Patricia Mohammed in Unmasking Masculinity and Deconstructing Patriarchy, masculinity in some senses, quote, "is a public more than private arrangement between men and men rather than primarily a relationship between men and women," unquote. These stories told in a homosocial environment provide the early lesson for these boys about how to perform being a Caribbean man. But neither John nor Tim can live up to these myths of manhood that they learned from their male forebears. John, for example, after hearing of Tim's falling asleep during sex with a woman, when, quote, "she was on the brink of orgasm," unquote, tells a story about his having sex with his pregnant wife right up to the day the child was born, to establish that he's more of a sex machine than Tim is. Moreover, notwithstanding Mohammed's claim about the public display, I wonder though if there is value in considering the private, intimate performances between men as a way of mapping other expressions of masculinities. In this homosocial world of competitiveness among men, John, the one who always won the competitions between them when they were boys, insists on interrogating Tim about the status of his sexual performance. So the first question that John asked Tim as they settle in the bar is, "Still fooping? Screwing chicks? You're too goddamn old to be still fooping," unquote. This is a subject that John comes back to time and time again, as if the repeated stories of masculine sexual prowess will secure his gendered identity. When Tim is reluctant to answer John's question, quote, "What kind of woman you like to screw?" John uses a reading of the Genesis story as a way of legitimizing a masculinity defined by sexual prowess, as expressed by the mythical first man, Adam. Quote, "I'm asking you a goddamn simple question, brother. A question that was first," and you notice what Roger Abrahams calls, or the kind of language, the cursing language, which is part of the way in which men are supposed to speak to each other. I'm asking you a goddamn simple question, brother. A question that was first asked in the Garden of Eden. A question put to that stupid bastard Adam when Adam couldn't make up his goddamn mind to take a piece off of Eve, or to take a bite out of the apple, speaking metaphorically, of course. When Tim relates a dream, so of course that reading of the Bible is about that Adam, his first thing is Adam is being defined by his sexual encounter. And the whole thing about the apple is about sex. When Tim relates a dream of a visit to a Chinese restaurant with Lang, John takes the opportunity to insist on a Jungian interpretation of that dream that reinforces gender stereotypes. Later, he concludes with Freudian psychoanalysis that all Tim's psychological problems are linked to his repressed sexuality. Quote, "You don't have no goddamn need." What need? All you need is a woman to give you a good foop. You're not talking like a West Indian, unquote. John's reading of Tim's experience is used to shore up his image as a real West Indian that is based on sexual prowess. It is a failure of the social performances that they are led to believe will ensure their secure membership as real West Indian men that lead to their substituting verbal performances for actual sexual performances. The sexual journey becomes a verbal one. And it is this kind of second kind of performance, this twice behaved behavior, a performance in words that is in excess of the social performance that alerts us to the ways in which normative discourse can be inscribed and revised at the same time. Moreover, when the oral performative tradition is pressed in service of this rhetorical performance, the performances become overdetermined. Roger Abrahams reminds us that the man of words is very attracted to speech competitions, and that Abrahams's reading of Caribbean expressive traditions, primarily marked as challenge and competition, might be a consequence of his own gendered reading. Tim, having been harassed enough by his friend, finally gets a competition going by employing the rhetorical mode of a preacher, parallel syntactic structures, an excess of metaphors, and the use of biblical and other literary allusions. And it's a wonderful passage, but I don't have enough time to read it for you. What Peter Roberts calls performance English he uses to convince John of his sexual potency. During all his rhetorical flourish, his auditor John is responding with swear words that punctuate the delivery like amens. thus performing in his speech act assent or a verbal translation of the applause. Yet the story gradually emerges as one of sexual failure, and that the men's self-consciousness about these self-inventions exposes a paradox of the value of performance to discursive production. The supplement of verbal performance for actual performance of normative discourse, in its excessive replay, exposes a self-consciousness that turns our attention to the nature of performance itself. It is first an activity that requires replay for its reiterative power in reinforcing identity. As Patricia Mohammed argues, quote, masculine gender identity was always the promise of what a man can do, not what he is. If the man could not fulfill this promise, then he was not a man. It is this fulfillment of the promise that requires the excess of narrative performance over and above social performance. Moreover, the social acts are legitimized by the symbolic citational practice. But performances are also embodied acts that are performed before an audience. Clarke's self-reflective staging of the performance's reception reminds us that audience can play an active role in the valuing of the performance, and our response is crucial in destabilizing gender norms. As John tells his story to Tim and vice versa, they both are evaluating each other's performances and recognizing disjunctions. Tim, for example, noticed, quote, the pictures of John's narrative are drawn with a heavier touch of language from the South than from those countries in Europe. I'm beginning to wonder, he says, how much of this talk he expects me to believe, unquote. Here, Tim is not only concerned with the content of the verbal performance, he's equally concerned with style and form. Throughout the tales, the two auditors are both critical and questioning, and they expertly read for the gaps in the stories and eventually create a space of intimacy in which self-disclosure becomes inevitable, what Tim calls his testimony of confession. While I agree with Butler and Coleman that all performances are embodied, and that this embodiment opens the possibility for refraction, Coleman's metaphor, and troubling Butler's metaphor of gender norms, I want to include audience reception as important to the theories of embodied performances, as Taylor has argued, by engaging the situ of embodied performance as a strategy of normative identity disruption. In this case, the fact that the bodies of these men are aging creates difficulties for the performance of the social script of the stud in the first place. Tim is also already suffering impotence, and John is having serious anxieties about his sexual abilities. Moreover, Tim is mourning the loss of Lang, and John is emotionally distraught over his son's serious illness, whom he might lose through death, and they eventually reveal their vulnerabilities to each other. The context of their verbal performances is a rumbar, which might suggest that overindulgence is a norm, although in this case, what Clarke does is to transform the bar into a confessional. Finally, their own anxious masculinities and the narrative self-reflexivity point us to the power of the audience to sanction these performances. In the end, a different view from the gender stereotypes emerges from these stories about Caribbean men, and it is our critical reception that allows us another view of these men as sensitive and insecure and sexually compromised. Repetition alone does not guarantee discursive institution. Public sanction is also necessary, and a more critical reception of the stories of men and male writers, especially in intimate spaces, might be one way to interrupt the normative scripts of masculinity. To the mimetic, ironic, or psychoanalytic readings, therefore, I want to add a phenomenological approach that assesses embodied performances of masculinities through the lens of intimacy, so that the slippages between theories of masculinities and their historical or embodied performances might expose a more nuanced account of Caribbean masculinities.
Like Sargent is disadvantaged from a class perspective, there is also the gender issue that she's trying to negotiate as well. And one of the ways in which I think that she's able to seduce and hustle him, because I think that when she's given her statement, there's some disingenuity there as well in terms of her trying to hustle him into buying into her story, and she does that by talking about what happens to her, but also involving him by talking about how he too was disadvantaged and how his masculinity was constantly questioned by the very white men that she would have slept with. And he realizes that she's right. He does feel like he's been crippled and been emasculated, but surprisingly, what she doesn't recognize is that he sees her as participating in that as well. And I guess it's at that point that I can talk about the relationship then between black women and men. I do agree that when you think of it within the Caribbean context, I'm not sure that we've done enough to explore the dynamic at work there. I think our North American scholars and colleagues have done quite a job in terms of looking at relationships between black men and women within those spaces, but I think that we can do a whole lot more, and perhaps that's something I'm trying to do here too. Take a look at that and start that kind of conversation. But I really appreciate the way in which my colleague here, Michael, is complicating our ideas of these fixed notions of even representations of Caribbean masculinity and how they change and fluctuate, especially when there is that migration aspect to take a look at. I know even we were having this conversation last night about our own private situations in terms of our own lives and how our spouses might function in one particular Caribbean space in terms of how they understand and perform gender expectations. But then when we're put in another location, right, we change, right, based on what that environment is like. But when you're transplanted again, retransplanted back in the Caribbean space, those things are reawakened in you, within you in particular ways. But again, I appreciate the way in which he's complicating it, because I think in my paper, I'm looking at how Clark is drawing on it in masculinity in its traditional sense, whereas I think he's complicating it to suggest that maybe here he has a different take on it and he's trying to trouble it and destabilize it in ways that you were talking about.
Part of the response to the polished whole. It's not an easy response to kind of ferret out these gender demarcations. Even the discussion of Sarge feeling so compromised. He's in the plantation house. The plantation house in the polished house is described with phallic symbolism about its dominance at the top of this hill, overhanging this place. And he has learned through physical abuse of the male body to subject himself there. He knows that he's coming to a place. While there is this gender dynamic happening between the man and the woman, it's also being mapped. She belongs to a class now that he's not a part of, and she belongs to that. So part of what I think you're trying to ferret out is this conflict between various discourses of power, and where does Clark, in the end, where is his investment? I would prefer to keep it in conflict than to resolve it. That's just my kind of thing. And the other thing I was trying to do, so that's one of the ways in which you can complicate it, by looking at the various intersecting discourses that sometimes compete as different subjectivities are seeking or trying to have access to power. And in what I was trying to do, I suspect, is to say that we need to find a variety, different lenses through which we interpret masculinities, and to be careful that we are not kind of reading only the public, this thing about public negotiation between men, and how private, intimate moments might also be these expressing another zone of the excluded or the abjected or the repressed. Yeah, and to bring some of that back into conversation. In other words, that in my view, that the masculinity is much more varied than we would like to acknowledge, and it's part of this attempt to expose some of that. It's too good a question for me to respond. Because what you're also offering is another lens where that kind of sight can I use the word, a queer kind of conception, queering gender through that kind of notion, so that you don't begin with these traditional conceptions. You begin with a troubling. Yeah? And I think that would lead down a very productive road. So I would need some time, Dr. Brown, to think it through, but I think that's a productive kind of way, and it might even be valuable, especially since, you know, there is this female, male, female, yes.
Well, one of the examples I often use to talk about how rich the Caribbean is as a space, to think about problematizing gender to every end, is through the linguistic continuum of the Anglo-Caribbean in particular. And I'm talking specifically about the Creoles that are spoken in the Anglo-Caribbean islands. I'll use my own example and Jamaica's, which I am familiar with. The use of the pronoun, the object pronoun, he. Let me give him, in Jamaica, I think it's a little bit more split, but in the Tobago Creole, the word he, the object pronoun, is used for both genders. Bring and I think is similar in Jamaica. Bring the could be him or her. And when I teach, I use the example of Caster Semenya. Her body, that's the South African runner who became very embattled in this global gender thing. And the fact is that her body was very recognizable by her family and her community to be a female body. It is only the world that misrecognizes it to be a differently gendered body. And that kind of ambiguity that the world sees, but that we have already, or that they have already accessed, is already accessible in the Caribbean as well in terms of that language game or reality, as it will. And I'm thinking that every time often when we talk about gender and complicating gender constructs, etc., we talk about the complicating of gender constructs, but sometimes we restrict the constructions to the very deterministic domain of the biology and the biological body. So I'm wondering to what extent might those very varied pockets and traces in the Caribbean be used to offer us another kind of epistemology, as it will, to understand the male body outside of that biologically determined frame.